What gladiators did to female prisoners after their victory was worse than death. The war did not end when the fighting stopped. For many women, that was when their suffering truly began. When the Roman armies defeated a land, they did not only take gold or weapons. They took people. Villages were burned, families were broken, and women were separated from everything they had ever known. Some had been living quiet lives only days before, cooking meals, caring for children, working in fields. Now they were forced to walk behind soldiers, tied together, pushed forward without knowing where they were going. The journey to Rome was long and painful. The women were exhausted, hungry, and confused. No one explained their fate. Guards spoke in harsh voices, using a language many of them did not understand. If someone slowed down, she was forced to move faster. If someone cried, she was ignored. At night, they slept on cold ground, looking up at unfamiliar stars, wondering if they would ever see their homes again. Some women tried to stay strong by remembering their families. They whispered names under their breath, mothers, children, sisters, afraid that forgetting those names would mean losing the last piece of themselves. Others stayed silent, their eyes empty, already broken by what they had seen during the war. No one knew which women would survive the journey and which would disappear along the way. When they finally reached the great cities of the empire, fear grew stronger. The buildings were massive, the streets loud, and the people stared at them like they were not human. To the crowd, they were not women with stories and lives. They were prisoners, spoils of victory, proof that Rome had won again. The women were taken underground beneath the stone floors of massive arenas. These dark holding areas smelled of damp walls and fear. There were no windows, only torches that flickered and cast long shadows. The sounds above them were confusing at first, footsteps, shouting, metal clashing. But soon the women realized something important. These places were connected to entertainment, to games, to bloodshed. They could hear crowds cheering, laughing, shouting names they did not recognize. The ground sometimes trembled as if the earth itself was reacting to the noise. Guards walked back and forth, laughing with one another, treating the place like a normal workplace. To them, this was routine. To the women, it felt like the world had ended. Days passed without explanation. Food was given, but only enough to survive. Water was limited. Time lost meaning. The women tried to guess what would happen next by listening to the guards' conversations. They heard words like victory, reward, and crowd. None of it sounded good. Some women had heard stories before the war, stories about Roman games, about fighters who battled for the crowd's pleasure. Those stories always focused on the warriors, the cheers, the drama. No one talked about what happened behind the scenes. No one talked about prisoners like them. Fear spread quietly. One woman, older than the others, tried to comfort the younger ones. She told them to stay together, to keep their heads down, to watch and listen. She had lived long enough to understand power. She knew that when people were treated like objects, the danger was greater than death itself. At night, whispers filled the darkness. Some women prayed to gods they were not sure could hear them anymore. Others promised themselves that they would survive no matter what. A few talked about escape, but deep down they knew it was impossible. The walls were thick, the guards many, and the city above was foreign and dangerous. Occasionally, guards would enter and point at a woman. No reason was given. The chosen woman would be taken away through a narrow passage. Sometimes she returned hours later, quiet and changed. Sometimes she did not return at all. No one asked questions anymore. The answers were too frightening. The women began to understand that their bodies were no longer their own. Their future depended entirely on the decisions of others. This realization was crushing. For some, it broke their spirit faster than hunger or exhaustion ever could. They learned that survival did not always mean living. It sometimes meant continuing to breathe while everything else was taken away. Above them, the arena came alive during game days. The noise was overwhelming. Thousands of voices moved together like a storm. The women could hear metal striking metal, the roar after a fighter fell, and the sudden silence when a life ended. They imagined the scene without wanting to. They knew those cheers were for victory, and victory brought rewards. What frightened them most was not the fighters themselves, but the system that supported everything. This was not chaos. This was organized cruelty. Every person had a role, and the prisoners were part of the reward. Some women wondered if death in battle would have been easier. At least it would have been quick. At least it would have been final. Living in waiting, not knowing what would be demanded of them next, was a slow and painful kind of suffering. As days turned into weeks, hope became dangerous. Hope made the disappointment worse. So many women learned to survive by feeling less, by thinking less, by becoming invisible even to themselves. They stopped dreaming of home. They stopped imagining rescue. Survival became about lasting one more day. And yet, even in that darkness, something human remained. A shared glance, a hand squeezed in the dark, a whispered reminder that they were still people, even if the world refused to see them that way. These small acts of connection were the only resistance they had. They did not know yet what would happen after the next victory. They did not know how much worse it could become. But deep inside, every woman felt it. The sense that the games above were only the beginning, and that what awaited them after the cheers faded would test the limits of human endurance. The empire celebrated its victories loudly. Beneath its stones, the forgotten waited in silence. The day of the games always began before sunrise. Even in the underground holding areas, the women could sense when something important was about to happen. The guards moved faster than usual. Torches were lit earlier. The sound of footsteps echoed more often through the stone passages. Above them, the city was waking up, preparing for a day of excitement and noise. The women were ordered to stand in lines. Some were shaking, not from cold but from fear. They had learned that game days brought change, and change was rarely good. No one explained what was expected of them. Silence was the rule. Questions were ignored. Obedience was the only way to avoid punishment. As the sun rose higher, the sounds from above grew louder. Trumpets announced the opening of the arena. Crowds poured into their seats, laughing and talking as if this were a festival. For them, it was a celebration. For the women below, it was a reminder that their suffering was invisible to those who cheered. The ground trembled as the first fights began. The women could hear the clash of weapons, the roar of the crowd, and the sudden silence that followed certain moments. Each sound carried meaning, even if they did not fully understand it. Cheers meant victory. Victory meant rewards, and rewards often came at a cost to those who had no power. Some women covered their ears, but it did not help. The noise traveled through the stone, through their bodies, into their thoughts. They imagined the fighters above, men trained to survive, men who had learned how to earn favor in a brutal system. These fighters were praised, admired, and feared. Their success gave them status that ordinary people could never reach. As the fights continued, guards came and went. They spoke to one another with excitement, discussing who had fought well and who had impressed the crowd. Names were mentioned again and again. Certain fighters were clearly favorites. The women listened carefully, trying to understand what each name might mean for their own future. Hours passed slowly. Food was forgotten. Water was limited. The air became heavy and warm as torches burned and bodies crowded the small space. Some women felt faint, but no one dared to sit unless told. Weakness drew attention, and attention could be dangerous. Then, after a particularly loud cheer from above, the guards' behavior changed. Smiles appeared on their faces. They straightened their posture. One of them laughed and said that the crowd was pleased. That single sentence filled the room with dread. Soon after, a list of names or descriptions was quietly shared among the guards. They looked at the women more closely now, pointing, whispering, making decisions without explanation. One guard walked slowly along the line, stopping in front of certain women, studying them as if they were items rather than people. Those chosen were ordered to step forward. No reason was given. Some women tried to hide behind others, but it did not work. The guard's eyes were sharp, trained to notice fear and hesitation. When a woman was selected, resistance only made things worse. The chosen women were taken through a narrow passageway, away from the others. The remaining women watched in silence, their hearts pounding. They did not know where their companions were going, only that they were leaving the small safety of the group. Time moved strangely after that. Minutes felt like hours. Every sound from the passage made the women tense, expecting footsteps or voices. Some women whispered prayers. Others stared at the wall, counting cracks in the stone to distract themselves from fear. When some of the women finally returned, they were different. They walked slower. Their eyes avoided contact. They did not speak, even when gently asked what had happened. Their silence was louder than words. It told the others everything they needed to know, that something had been taken from them that could not be returned. Not everyone came back. Those absences were felt deeply. The empty spaces in the line became symbols of uncertainty. The women did not know if those taken away had been moved elsewhere, sold, or lost forever. The not knowing was almost unbearable. Above ground, the games ended with celebration. Victors were praised. Crowds left the arena satisfied, talking about skill and bravery. They returned to their homes, carrying memories of excitement. None of them thought about what happened beneath the stone floors once the cheering stopped. Below, the women were left to deal with the aftermath. No comfort was offered. No explanations were given. Guards returned to their normal routines as if nothing unusual had happened. To them, this was simply how things worked. As night fell, exhaustion took over. Some women slept despite the fear, their bodies giving in when their minds could not. Others stayed awake, afraid of being chosen again, afraid of dreams that felt too real. One young woman whispered that she wished the games would never end, because as long as the crowd was watching, there were limits. When the crowd left, anything could happen without witnesses. Her words spread quietly, settling into everyone's thoughts. The women began to understand that the arena was not just a place of fighting. It was a center of power. Those who entertained the crowd were rewarded. Those who could not fight had no protection at all. The system did not care about fairness or suffering. It only cared about control and pleasure. Days after the games, the atmosphere changed again. Some guards were more relaxed, others more demanding. Rumors spread about what might come next: sales, transfers, punishments. The women learned to read small signs: a look, a tone of voice, a delay in food. Every detail mattered now. Despite everything, small moments of humanity still appeared. A woman shared her bread with someone weaker. Another cleaned the wounds of a companion using water and torn cloth. These acts were quiet and risky, but they helped the women remember that they were still human. Fear became a constant companion. It did not come and go, it stayed. It shaped every thought, every movement. The women no longer asked why this was happening. They only asked how long it would last. Some began to believe that surviving the games was only the beginning of a longer suffering. Victory above did not mean relief below. It meant new dangers, new losses, and deeper silence. As the torches dimmed and the underground grew quiet, the women lay awake, listening to the distant sounds of the city. Life continued above them as if nothing had changed. But below, everything had changed. They now understood that the cheers of victory were not meant for them. Those cheers were echoes of a world that had decided they no longer mattered. And the worst part was knowing that tomorrow, the crowd would gather again, and the cycle would continue. After the excitement of the games faded, a strange quiet settled over the underground halls. The cheers were gone. The heavy footsteps of crowds no longer echoed above. What remained was a deep silence that felt heavier than noise. For the women, this silence was frightening because it meant the eyes of the public were no longer watching. This was the time when power showed its true face. The guards changed their behavior again. During the games, they had been careful, almost alert, knowing that many important people were nearby. Now they were more relaxed, more careless, and sometimes crueler. Their voices grew louder, their jokes sharper. They acted like the underground belonged only to them. The women were no longer lined up together as often. Instead, they were separated into smaller groups. Some were moved to different rooms without explanation. Others were told to clean, carry water, or perform tiring tasks from morning until night. Work was not meant to help them. It was meant to remind them who controlled every moment of their lives. One woman, who had once been the daughter of a respected elder in her village, was ordered to scrub stone floors until her hands bled. No one cared. Another woman was forced to stand for hours holding heavy containers. When she dropped one, she was shouted at and punished with more work. Strength no longer mattered. Only obedience did. The fighters who had won in the arena were treated very differently. They were praised, given better food, and allowed to move with confidence. People spoke to them with respect. Some guards even bowed their heads slightly when these men passed. Victory had lifted them above others, even above the law in certain ways. The women noticed this difference clearly. They understood that the system rewarded strength and performance, not fairness or kindness. Those who entertained the crowd were protected. Those who did not were forgotten. Sometimes, a victorious fighter would pass near the holding areas. The women lowered their eyes, afraid of drawing attention. They had learned that attention could bring trouble. These men walked with confidence, knowing that few would question their actions. The system had taught them that rewards were earned and limits were flexible. The worst part for the women was the uncertainty. No one told them what tomorrow would bring. No one explained why some women were taken away permanently while others stayed. Rumors spread quietly about being sold, transferred, or forced into long service far from the arena. Every rumor carried fear. Some women tried to keep track of time by marking the walls with small scratches. Others counted meals, but days blurred together. Without sunlight or freedom, time lost meaning. Life became a series of moments to endure rather than days to live. The emotional weight grew heavier than the physical pain. Many women struggled to remember who they had been before. Their old lives felt like stories from another world. Names, faces, and places slowly faded, replaced by stone walls and torchlight. One woman, still very young, asked an older one how to survive without losing herself. The older woman paused for a long time before answering. Finally, she said that survival sometimes meant changing on the outside while protecting something small and quiet inside. "Hide it," she whispered. "Hide who you are so they cannot take everything." This advice spread among the women. They learned to speak less, to react less, to make themselves small and unnoticed. It was not weakness, it was strategy. Still, not everyone could do it. Some women broke under the pressure. They cried openly, shouted in anger, or refused orders. The system responded quickly and harshly. After that, the others learned an important lesson. Showing pain only invited more of it. At night, when the guards were fewer, the women shared stories in whispers. They talked about rivers near their homes, the smell of bread cooking, the sound of laughter during festivals. These memories hurt, but they also kept something alive inside them. Remembering was an act of quiet resistance. One woman spoke of her children and wondered if they were still alive. Another remembered her mother's voice. These moments of shared memory created bonds stronger than fear. The women became each other's family in a place that tried to erase all connections. Above them, life in the city continued. Markets opened. People argued, laughed, and celebrated. The empire moved forward, proud of its power and order. Very few questioned what that power was built on. The women began to understand that cruelty did not always come from anger. Often, it came from indifference. Most people simply did not care what happened beneath the arena. As long as entertainment continued, suffering could remain hidden. This realization was deeply painful. It meant that rescue was unlikely. Justice was not coming. The system was too large, too accepted, and too comfortable for those who benefited from it. Some women stopped hoping entirely. Hope had become dangerous. It made disappointment sharper. Instead, they focused on surviving one task, one order, one night at a time. Others held on to hope quietly, like a secret flame. They did not speak of it, but it guided their actions. They stayed alert. They watched for patterns. They learned which guards were careless, which moments were safest, which paths were used most often. Even without freedom, they searched for small ways to protect themselves and each other. The fighters continued their training. More games were announced. The cycle repeated. With each victory above, the balance of power below shifted again. Rewards were given. Punishments followed. The women learned that victory for some always meant loss for others. What hurt most was realizing that this suffering was not accidental. It was part of a system designed to break people without killing them, to use them without acknowledging their humanity. As weeks passed, the women were no longer shocked by cruelty. They expected it. This numbness was both a shield and a loss. It protected them from constant fear, but it also took something away that could never fully return. Yet even in this state, small moments mattered. A shared look of understanding. A quiet warning passed between women. A hand placed gently on another's shoulder. These moments reminded them that they were still alive, still connected, still human. They did not know how long this life would last. They did not know what future waited for them. But they understood one thing clearly now. Surviving here required more than strength. It required silence, patience, and the courage to endure a world that refused to see them. And as the empire celebrated its order and victories, the women below continued to live in the shadows, carrying the weight of a power that had no limits, and a suffering that history would almost forget. With time, the women realized that the worst pain was not always loud or sudden. It was slow. It arrived quietly and stayed. Days passed, then weeks, and the underground no longer felt temporary. It felt permanent, like a shadow that would never lift. Some women were moved away one by one. They were taken early in the morning, before the others were fully awake. A guard would call a name or point, and that woman would be led down a corridor that never seemed to return anyone. The remaining women watched these moments with heavy hearts. They did not cry anymore. Tears had become too costly. Those who were moved were often sent to distant places. Some were assigned to work in large households. Others were transferred to unfamiliar regions of the empire. Their paths disappeared from the lives of the women who remained. They became memories instead of companions. For those who stayed near the arena, life became a cycle of work and waiting. They cleaned, carried, repaired, and served. Their bodies were always tired, but rest was limited. The purpose of the work was not efficiency. It was control. Constant activity left little room for thought. The women learned that silence was safer than words. Speaking too much brought attention. Asking questions brought trouble, so they spoke only when necessary, using short sentences and lowered voices. Over time, some forgot the sound of their own laughter. Others forgot what it felt like to speak freely. The loss of identity was slow but deep. Names were replaced by commands. Backgrounds no longer mattered. Whether a woman had once been a farmer, a mother, or a leader meant nothing here. The system did not see individuals. It saw usefulness. One woman tried to hold onto her name by repeating it in her thoughts every night. Another remembered the stories her grandmother used to tell. These private rituals became small anchors, keeping them from drifting too far from who they once were. Yet even these anchors weakened over time. The women noticed that new prisoners sometimes arrived. They came with the same confusion and fear the others had once felt. Their eyes were wide, their movements uncertain. The older prisoners recognized themselves in them and felt a deep sadness. They wanted to warn them, to protect them, but words could not change the reality. Instead, they offered quiet guidance. They showed them where to stand, when to speak, when to stay still. They taught them how to survive without drawing attention. This passing of knowledge became another form of resistance. Not all women endured in the same way. Some grew distant, almost invisible, moving through tasks like shadows. Others held on to a quiet strength, helping where they could, comforting others in silence. A few lost the will to care at all, doing only what was required, nothing more. The guards noticed these changes but did not care. To them, this was proof that the system worked. Broken spirits were easier to manage. Silence was convenient. Above ground, celebrations continued. New games were announced. New fighters rose and fell. The city praised order and discipline, never questioning the cost. The empire believed that strength justified everything. Below ground, the women lived with constant uncertainty. They never knew when they would be moved, punished, or forgotten. This uncertainty was its own kind of pain. It kept them alert, restless, unable to relax even for a moment. At night, when the work was done and the guards less present, the women gathered close together. Not to talk much, but to feel less alone. Sometimes they shared small pieces of food. Sometimes they simply sat side by side, listening to each other breathe. One evening, a woman spoke softly about the idea of dignity. She said that even if everything else was taken, choosing kindness toward each other was a way to keep dignity alive. Her words stayed with the others. They could not control their situation, but they could control how they treated one another. From that night on, small acts of care became more common. A hand offered to help someone stand. A quiet warning when danger was near. A shared look that said, "I see you." These moments did not change their fate, but they changed how they faced it. The emotional weight of living without choice pressed heavily on them. Some women felt anger burning inside, but they learned to hide it. Anger had nowhere safe to go. Others felt numb, as if their hearts had learned to close themselves off to survive. There were moments when memories returned unexpectedly. The smell of food reminded someone of home. A song hummed by a guard reminded another of a festival long ago. These moments were painful, but they also proved that something inside them was still alive. The women understood now that survival did not always look heroic. It looked quiet. It looked patient. It looked like waking up every day and continuing, even when there was no reward for doing so. Some wondered if history would ever remember them, if anyone would know what had happened beneath the stone floors. Most believed the answer was no. Their lives were not meant to be recorded. They were meant to be used and forgotten. This knowledge was heavy, but it also brought clarity. If the world would not witness their suffering, then the only witnesses they had were each other. And that had to be enough. As time passed, the women stopped counting days. They counted moments of safety instead. A day without punishment. A night without fear. A morning where everyone was still there. They learned that enduring was an act of strength. Not the kind praised by crowds, but the kind that keeps a person alive when everything else tries to erase them. And while the empire stood tall above them, proud and unchallenged, the women below continued to exist in quiet defiance. Their bodies were controlled, their futures uncertain, but their shared humanity, though wounded, was not fully destroyed. They carried their suffering silently, knowing that silence was the price of survival. And as they waited for whatever came next, they held onto one truth. Even in a world built on power without mercy, choosing to remain human was its own kind of victory. As years passed, the rhythm of life beneath the stone floors slowly changed. Some women were moved far away. Others remained, growing older in a place that never truly felt like a home. New faces arrived, wide-eyed and afraid, while familiar faces disappeared without explanation. Time did not heal the pain, but it softened some edges, turning sharp fear into a steady ache. For a few women, chance opened a narrow door. A change in ownership, a transfer of duties, or the kindness of one person in power altered the path of their lives. These moments were rare and unpredictable. When they happened, the women learned to step carefully, knowing that one wrong move could close the door forever. Those who left carried the underground with them. Even when the air was open and the sky visible, their bodies remembered stone walls and torchlight. Loud sounds made them tense. Sudden orders made their hearts race. Freedom, when it came, felt unfamiliar and fragile, like something borrowed rather than owned. Some women found work in quiet places, far from crowds. They learned new routines and tried to rebuild ordinary lives. Others lived in large households, performing tasks that kept them busy from morning until night. They survived, but survival came with memories that did not fade easily. A few women never left. They aged where they stood, becoming part of the background. Their hair turned gray. Their steps slowed. Younger prisoners watched them with a mix of fear and respect. These older women became living proof of endurance. They spoke little, but when they did, their words carried weight. One such woman often said that remembering was both a burden and a duty. Forgetting would make life easier, but remembering gave meaning to what had been endured. Her words stayed with those who listened. Above ground, the empire continued to change. Leaders rose and fell. New laws were written. New buildings replaced old ones. Over time, the games lost some of their importance. Crowds found new forms of entertainment. What had once been central to public life slowly became history. When the arenas grew quiet, people began to look back. Writers and thinkers started asking questions. They studied records, letters, and old laws. They noticed the gaps, names missing, lives unrecorded, stories untold. Curiosity turned into concern. Slowly, a fuller picture began to form. Historians realized that the glory of victory had hidden a deep cost. The achievements celebrated in stone and song were supported by countless invisible lives. Women, especially, had been pushed into the shadows, their suffering treated as unimportant or natural. As these truths surfaced, the story changed. The arena was no longer seen only as a place of skill and excitement. It became a symbol of power without balance, where entertainment was valued more than humanity. The women who had lived through those years did not expect recognition. Many were gone by the time people began to listen, but their experiences shaped the understanding of those who came after. In quiet homes and distant places, survivors shared what they could with those they trusted. They spoke of fear, of waiting, of learning how to endure when choice was taken away. They spoke carefully, not to shock, but to be honest. Some listeners struggled to believe these stories. Others felt shame. A few felt responsibility. Over time, these conversations changed how the past was taught and remembered. The women's suffering was no longer entirely invisible. For the survivors, peace did not arrive all at once. It came in small pieces: a calm morning, a safe place to sleep, a meal shared without fear. Trust rebuilt slowly, if at all. Many learned that healing did not mean forgetting. It meant learning how to live alongside memory without being ruled by it. Some found comfort in helping others. Some found it in quiet work. Some found it in family, built or chosen. And some found it simply in waking up each day and choosing to continue. The system that once controlled their lives eventually fell away, but its effects remained. The women carried lessons learned in silence: how power can shape behavior, how fear can become normal, and how kindness can survive even in harsh conditions. These lessons mattered beyond their own lives. Centuries later, people standing in the ruins of old arenas feel a strange mix of awe and discomfort. They admire the architecture, the skill, the ambition, but they also sense the weight of what happened there. The stones do not speak, but history does. It reminds the world that progress is not only measured by buildings and victories, but by how the most vulnerable are treated. It reminds us that suffering hidden from view is still suffering. And it reminds us that silence does not mean acceptance. It often means survival. The women who endured did not see themselves as heroes. They did not seek praise. Their strength was quiet, shaped by necessity rather than choice. Yet their lives hold meaning beyond what they could have imagined. They show that even when dignity is denied, it can be protected in small ways. Even when voices are ignored, they can still matter. Even when history forgets, truth has a way of returning. In the end, the story is not about spectacle or victory. It is about people who lived through a system that refused to see them, and who survived anyway. Their lives ask a simple but powerful question of every generation that follows. What kind of world are we building, and who pays the price for it? The answer matters, because remembering the past is not only about honoring those who suffered. It is about choosing a future where such suffering is no longer accepted as normal. And in that choice, the voices once buried beneath stone finally find the space to be heard.